Sign it, and you lose everything. The voice didn't come from the board members, or the investors, or the sharply dressed men who believed they controlled the room. It came from behind them. Soft. Calm. Uninvited. The pen in Ethan Caldwell's hand paused just an inch above the paper, a $300 million Korean acquisition waiting for ink that could reshape his empire. The skyline of Manhattan stretched behind the glass walls, glowing gold in the late evening light, but inside the room, something colder had taken hold. Conversations died mid-breath. Chairs stopped shifting. Even the quiet hum of the air conditioning seemed to fade. Ethan didn't turn right away. Men like him weren't used to interruptions, especially not from someone who wasn't supposed to exist in their world. His jaw tightened, his grip on the Mont Blanc pen steady, controlled. Across the table, the Korean executives sat perfectly composed, their expressions polite, unreadable, but their eyes flickered for a fraction of a second. That flicker was the only crack in the performance. And someone had noticed. Naomi Brooks stood near the far end of the room, a silver tray balanced effortlessly in her hand, untouched glasses reflecting the dim overhead lights. To most people, she was invisible. Just another waitress in a pressed black uniform, moving quietly between power and money. Earlier, one of the junior executives had snapped his fingers at her without looking, calling her sweetheart as if it were her name. She hadn't reacted. She never did. But she had been listening. Every word. Every pause. Every translation. Because the deal wasn't just being negotiated in English. It moved through Korean, filtered and reshaped by the man standing beside Ethan, Daniel Park, the trusted translator. Or at least, trusted until this moment. Ethan finally turned his head, slowly, deliberately, like a man deciding whether something deserved his attention. His blue eyes landed on Naomi, scanning her once, dismissively at first, then again when he realized she wasn't backing down. She didn't lower her gaze. She didn't apologize. She didn't move. "What did you just say?" Ethan asked, his voice low, controlled, but edged. With something sharper beneath. Naomi stepped forward, just one step, careful, precise, like crossing an invisible line no one had given her permission to cross. The tray in her hand didn't shake. Her voice didn't either. "Your translator is lying." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They landed. Heavy. Final. Around the table, subtle shifts began. A glance exchanged between two Korean executives. A tightening of Daniel Park's posture. A brief, almost imperceptible hesitation in his breathing. Ethan noticed all of it. He always did. That was how he had built his empire, reading what others missed. But this wasn't supposed to be part of the equation. "That's a serious accusation," Daniel said quickly, a polite smile stretching just a little too tight across his face. He spoke in English, then repeated something in Korean, his tone smooth, practiced. But Naomi didn't look at him. She looked at Ethan. "He's not translating everything," she said. "And what he is translating isn't accurate." A silence followed, deeper this time. Not confusion. Not discomfort. Something closer to realization, still forming, still dangerous. Ethan's pen lowered slowly to the table. Not signed. Not yet. Because for the first time in that room, control had shifted. And it hadn't come from the people sitting at the table. It had come from the one person no one thought mattered. Daniel Park let out a quiet breath, the kind that tried to sound calm but carried the weight of calculation, and for the first time since the meeting began his confidence did not fill the room the same way. It flickered, just slightly, like a light that knew it might go out, while Ethan Caldwell leaned back in his chair with slow precision, his fingers steepled together, his eyes no longer scanning contracts or projections but studying people, because numbers could lie on paper but people always told the truth if you knew where to look, and right now the truth was not coming from the man he had trusted to bridge two languages, it was standing across the room holding a tray. "Explain," Ethan said, not raising his voice, not needing to, because power did not shout, it focused, and every head turned not toward Daniel, but toward Naomi, who did not rush, who did not stumble over her words, who simply set the tray down on the edge of the polished table with a soft, deliberate sound that seemed louder than it should have been in the silence, and then she spoke, the clause he just translated about distribution rights, she said, her voice even. That is not what they said. A ripple moved through the Korean executives, subtle but undeniable. One of them shifted in his seat, another adjusted his cuff, and Daniel quickly interjected, a polite chuckle slipping out too fast. I think there is a misunderstanding. She is not familiar with legal Korean terminology, he said, but he did not look at Naomi when he said it. He looked at Ethan, because that was where his safety depended, but Naomi did not react to the dismissal. She did not defend herself. She simply turned her head slightly toward the Korean side of the table and spoke again, this time in Korean, fluid, precise, the rhythm natural, not rehearsed, and the effect was immediate. One of the executives straightened, his expression shifting from polite neutrality to sharp attention. Another responded to her directly, his tone measured but no longer guarded, and for a moment the room split into two realities, the one Daniel had been controlling, and the one now unfolding without him. Ethan's eyes narrowed just slightly, not in anger, but in recalibration. Because this was the moment where instinct took over, the same instinct that had built billion-dollar decisions from seconds of doubt. What did they actually say? Ethan asked, his voice quieter now, more dangerous because it was searching for truth, and Naomi turned back to him, meeting his gaze without hesitation. They said the exclusivity is conditional, she replied, conditional on performance benchmarks that are not in your version of the contract. A pause followed, heavy, mathematical, as if the entire room was recalculating risk in real time. $300 million no longer a number but a question. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but one of the Korean executives spoke first, in English this time, his tone careful, diplomatic. We believed your side understood the conditions clearly, he said, and that was enough. Not an accusation, not a confrontation, just a statement, but statements like that did not need force. They carried consequences on their own. Ethan's gaze shifted slowly back to Daniel, and in that moment the balance of the room changed completely, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably, because trust, once questioned, did not return quietly. And Daniel felt it, the subtle distance, the invisible step back, the space where authority used to be, and for the first time since the meeting began, he did not control the conversation. Naomi did, and she had not raised her voice, she had not asked for attention, she had simply spoken the truth, and the truth had done the rest. The room did not erupt, it tightened, like a wire pulled too far, too fast, because this was not the kind of mistake that could be brushed aside with a polite apology or a revised document. This was structural, this was intentional, and Ethan Caldwell knew the difference. He had built his reputation on knowing the difference, and now that knowledge was turning inward, forcing him to re-examine every word that had been spoken in the last 45 minutes, every nod, every pause, every translated sentence that he had accepted without question, and that realization did not show on his face, not fully, but it shifted something deeper, something colder, something more precise. Show me the clause, he said, his voice level, controlled, but final, and this time he did not look at Daniel when he said it, he looked at Naomi, and that alone changed everything, because authority had just moved again, quietly, decisively. Naomi stepped closer to the table, her movements measured, not hurried, as if she had always belonged in that space even when no one else believed it. She reached for the document, careful, respectful, but not hesitant, and pointed to a section midway through the page, lines of dense legal language that most people would skim and trust someone else to interpret, but not her. Right here, she said, and then she translated directly from Korean, word for word, no embellishment, no smoothing, just the raw meaning, and as she spoke, the difference became undeniable. The conditional terms, the performance thresholds, the escape clauses that shifted risk almost entirely onto Ethan's company, details that had been softened, minimized, or omitted entirely in Daniel's version, and with each sentence, the silence in the room grew heavier, not confused, not uncertain, but aware that something significant had just been uncovered. One of the Korean executives leaned forward slightly, his hands folded, his expression no longer guarded but engaged. That is correct, he said calmly, confirming her translation without hesitation, and that confirmation landed harder than any accusation could have, because it removed doubt, it removed interpretation, it left only truth. Daniel's composure finally cracked, not dramatically, not loudly, but enough, a tightening around his eyes, a shift in posture, a brief inhale that came too late. There may have been some contextual nuance, he began, but his words did not carry the same weight anymore, because context only worked when trust existed, and trust had already moved across the room. Ethan leaned back again, slower this time, his gaze fixed on the contract, then on Daniel, then back to Naomi, and in that sequence a decision was forming, not emotional, not reactive, but calculated, the kind that determined outcomes far beyond a single meeting. Why? Ethan asked finally. A single word, directed at Daniel, but carrying far more than a simple question, and Daniel hesitated, just long enough for the room to notice, just long enough for the answer to become less important than the pause itself, because in rooms like this, hesitation was confession, not of guilt perhaps, but of imbalance, and imbalance was risk, and Ethan Caldwell did not invest in risk he did not control. The Korean executives exchanged another glance, subtle but telling, as if reassessing not just the deal, but the man across from them, because how a leader responded to truth mattered more than the mistake itself, and Ethan knew that, he always had, which was why his next move did not come from pride, it came from clarity. He closed the folder slowly, deliberately, the sound soft but final, and placed the pen down beside it, untouched, unsigned. $300 million, no longer a decision waiting to happen, but a decision already made, not to proceed, not like this, not under uncertainty, not under someone else's version of the truth. And then he looked at Naomi again, not as a waitress, not as background, but as the only person in the room who had nothing to gain and still chose to speak, and that was the kind of signal he trusted most. The decision did not explode, it settled, heavy and undeniable, like a door closing that no one could reopen, and for a moment no one spoke because they all understood what had just happened, not just a pause in negotiation but a shift in control, the kind that changed reputations, partnerships, and futures. Ethan Caldwell did not raise his voice, he did not accuse. He simply looked at the Korean executives with the same calm authority that had built his name and said, "We will need to revisit the terms with full clarity," and that sentence carried more weight than any confrontation could have, because it acknowledged the truth without assigning blame, it protected the deal without surrendering leverage, and most importantly, it showed that he was still in control, even after realizing he had almost signed something he did not fully understand. One of the executives nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful now rather than guarded. "That would be wise," he replied, and there was no tension in his tone, only respect, because in that moment Ethan had done something rare. He had chosen accuracy over ego, and that choice was noticed. Daniel Park remained still, his hands clasped too tightly in front of him, his usual composure replaced by something quieter, something smaller, not collapse, not failure, but exposure, because in rooms like this you did not need to be proven wrong loudly. You only needed to be proven unnecessary, and that was what had just happened. The meeting began to dissolve in subtle ways. Chairs shifted back an inch, folders closed softly, assistants moved with quiet efficiency to gather documents, but no one rushed, no one broke the calm surface of professionalism, because the real conversation had already ended the moment the truth entered the room. Naomi stepped back instinctively, returning to the edge of the space as if she understood her role was complete, as if she had only crossed that invisible line long enough to restore balance and now intended to disappear again into the background where no one would question her presence. But Ethan noticed that movement, he noticed everything now. Not just the deal, not just the executives, but her, the way she carried herself, the way she had spoken without hesitation, without arrogance, without fear, and most of all, without asking for anything in return. "Wait," he said, not loudly, but clearly enough to stop her before she could fully step away, and that single word shifted the focus of the room once more, not toward the contract, not toward the deal, but toward the person who had just changed both. Naomi paused, turning slightly, her expression composed, not expectant, not uncertain, just present. Ethan stood slowly, buttoning his jacket with a measured motion that reflected habit, discipline, control, and then he walked toward her, not quickly, not dramatically, just directly, closing the distance that had existed between their worlds only minutes before. The executives watched, not with curiosity but with interest, because moments like this revealed more than negotiations ever could. They revealed character. "How did you know?" Ethan asked, his voice lower now. Not demanding, not challenging, but genuinely seeking, and for the first time since she had spoken, Naomi allowed a small shift in her expression, not a smile, not pride, just a quiet acknowledgement of the question. "Because they were being too polite," she said, and the answer seemed simple, almost too simple for the weight it carried, but it was not simplicity, it was awareness, the kind that came from listening beyond words. From noticing what was said and what was not. Ethan studied her for a moment longer, as if recalibrating everything he thought he understood about the room, about the deal, about the hierarchy that had existed before she spoke, and then he nodded once, not as a gesture of dismissal, but as recognition, clear and intentional. "You just saved me $300 million, he said, and this time there was no performance in his voice, no audience, just truth. And Naomi did not react the way most people would. She did not smile, she did not thank him, she simply held his gaze for a brief second and replied, "I just told you the truth." And in that moment, the difference between value and title became impossible to ignore, because titles could be given, money could be earned, but truth, spoken at the right moment, by the right person, that was something else entirely, something no one in that room could buy, and for the first time that night, Ethan Caldwell understood that clearly. The room did not return to what it had been, it could not, because once truth entered a space built on assumption, everything had to rearrange itself around it, and even as the Korean executives began to gather their materials with quiet professionalism, there was a new tone in the air, one that had nothing to do with contracts or numbers and everything to do with respect, not the kind that was announced, but the kind that settled silently, earned in a single moment that could not be undone. Ethan Caldwell remained where he stood for a second longer, watching Naomi as she instinctively reached again for her tray, as if returning to routine was the most natural response to what had just happened, as if saving a deal of that magnitude was just another task completed between pouring water and clearing glasses, and that contrast did not sit lightly with him, because he was a man who measured value in outcomes, in leverage, in results, and what she had done had shifted all three without asking for recognition. "You speak Korean fluently," he said, not as a question, but as an observation that still carried curiosity, and Naomi gave a small nod, not elaborate, not performative, just acknowledgement. "Yes," she replied, and nothing more, as if the explanation did not require a story, but Ethan was not finished, not this time, because understanding had become more important than assumption. "Where did you learn?" he asked, and this time the question lingered. Not in demand, but in genuine interest, and Naomi hesitated for just a fraction of a second, not out of uncertainty, but because she was choosing how much of herself to reveal in a room that had not seen her until minutes ago. "My mother," she said finally, her voice steady. She was a language teacher, and that was enough to shift the narrative again, not dramatically, but meaningfully, because it reframed her from invisible service to inherited knowledge, from overlooked presence to cultivated ability. Ethan nodded slowly, processing, connecting, recalibrating once more, because in his world, skills like that were assets, rare and valuable, yet here they had been standing in plain sight, unrecognized, dismissed by everyone in the room including himself, and that realization did not sit comfortably, not because it threatened him, but because it exposed a gap in how he saw people, a gap he had not noticed until now. Behind them, Daniel Park finally spoke again, his voice quieter than before, stripped of its earlier confidence. "I believe there has been a misunderstanding," he said, attempting to regain ground that had already shifted, but the words no longer carried influence, they sounded like an echo of authority rather than authority itself. Ethan did not turn immediately, he did not respond right away, and that pause was deliberate, because silence, used correctly, revealed more than any argument. When he did speak, his tone was even, controlled, but final. "We will review everything independently," he said, and that sentence did not accuse, it did not confront, but it removed reliance, and in a room built on trust, that was the most decisive move he could make. Daniel nodded, but it was not agreement, it was acceptance, because there was nothing left to negotiate in that moment. The Korean executives exchanged polite farewells, their posture now subtly different, more open, more respectful, not because the deal was secure, but because the leadership in front of them had just demonstrated something more valuable than control. It had demonstrated the ability to listen when it mattered. As they exited, the door closed softly behind them, leaving the room quieter than before, but not empty, because something remained, something unspoken but understood. Ethan turned back to Naomi once more, not out of obligation, but intention. "Do you plan to stay in service work?" he asked, and the question was not dismissive, it was exploratory, because he was no longer seeing her role, he was seeing her potential. Naomi met his gaze, calm as ever. "I plan to go where I am not overlooked," she said. And the words were simple, but they carried weight, not defiance, not ambition in the loud sense, but clarity, the kind that did not need to prove itself. Ethan held that answer for a moment, then nodded once, slower this time, because now he understood something he had not before. Value did not announce itself, it revealed itself, often in the moments people chose to ignore, and tonight, he had almost ignored the most valuable voice in the room. The room was quieter now, but not empty, because silence after truth was never the same as silence before it. It carried weight, it carried awareness, and Ethan Caldwell stood there for a moment longer than necessary, not because he did not know what to do next, but because for the first time that night, he was thinking beyond the deal, beyond the numbers, beyond the structure of the agreement that had almost been signed. He was thinking about something far less tangible and far more dangerous. To overlook perception, not how others saw him, but how he saw others, and that realization did not come with discomfort, it came with clarity, the kind that reshaped decisions quietly, permanently. Naomi had already reached for her tray again, her posture returning to the same composed stillness she had carried all evening, as if stepping back into invisibility was not a retreat but a habit, a system she had learned long before this room, long before these people, and Ethan watched that transition carefully, because it revealed more than her words ever could. It revealed how often she had been unseen, and how easily she could disappear again if no one chose otherwise. "You should not be here," Ethan said suddenly, not as criticism, not as dismissal, but as recognition, and Naomi paused, her hand resting lightly against the edge of the table, her expression unchanged. "I am here because I need to be," she replied, and the answer was simple, grounded, without apology. Ethan took a slow breath, considering that, because in his world, being somewhere was always a choice, calculated, strategic, driven by outcome, but for her, it carried something else, necessity, responsibility, reality, and that difference mattered more than he had ever allowed himself to consider. "No," he said, more quietly now, "I mean you should not be here doing this." He gestured slightly toward the tray, the uniform, the role that had defined how everyone in that room had perceived her until it was proven incomplete, and Naomi followed the gesture with her eyes for a brief second before looking back at him, not defensive, not offended, just aware. "It is honest work," she said, and there was no shame in her voice, no hesitation, only dignity, and that response shifted something again, because Ethan was not dismissing the work, he was recognizing the mismatch, the gap between what she was doing and what she was capable of, a gap he had nearly ignored, and that realization carried its own kind of weight. Behind them, the faint sound of the city filtered through the glass, distant traffic, a low hum of movement that reminded them both that the world outside this room had not stopped, even if something inside it had changed. Ethan reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a card, clean, minimal, his name printed in sharp black lettering that carried more access than most people would see in a lifetime. He held it for a second, not offering it immediately, because this was not charity, it was not impulse, it was a decision, and he did not make those lightly. "Come to my office tomorrow," he said, extending the card toward her, his tone even, direct, but without pressure. 9 o'clock. And the simplicity of the offer carried its own gravity, because it was not framed as a favor, it was framed as an opportunity. Naomi looked at the card but did not take it right away, and that hesitation was not uncertainty, it was evaluation, the same kind he had just applied to the deal, because she understood something most people did not, that every opportunity came with context, with expectation, with consequence. "For what?" she asked, and the question was not skeptical, it was precise, and Ethan did not smile, did not soften his tone, because honesty did not require decoration. "To make sure I never ignore someone like you again," he said, and for a moment the words hung there, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just real. Naomi studied him for a second longer, measuring not his title, not his wealth, but his intent, and then she reached forward and took the card, her fingers steady, her expression unchanged, but something in the air shifted again, not power this time, not control, but recognition, mutual, unspoken, earned, and as she slipped the card into the pocket of her apron, she gave a small nod, not agreement, not gratitude, but acknowledgement, and Ethan understood that, because in that moment, he was no longer offering something to someone beneath him. He was recognizing someone he had almost failed to see, and that difference, subtle as it was, would shape everything that came next. The elevator doors closed with a soft chime, sealing the moment behind glass and steel as if the entire night had been compressed into something smaller, quieter, easier to carry. But Naomi Brooks did not move right away, her hand still resting lightly against the edge of her apron pocket where the card now sat. sharp corners pressing against fabric like a reminder that something had shifted, not just in the room she had left, but in the path in front of her. Outside, Manhattan pulsed with its usual rhythm, headlights sliding across wet pavement, distant horns layering into a familiar hum, but inside her mind, everything was unusually still, because moments like that did not happen often, not for people like her, not in rooms like that, and certainly not without consequence. She stepped out into the service corridor, the lighting harsher here, fluorescent and practical, a contrast to the warm, controlled glow of the executive floor, and almost immediately the world tried to return her to where it believed she belonged. You disappeared for a while, her manager said as she passed, not unkindly, but without curiosity, without awareness of what had just occurred upstairs. Naomi nodded once. There was a delay, she replied, and that was all, because explaining it would not change anything here, not tonight. She returned to her routine with the same precision she always carried, clearing tables, refilling glasses, moving through spaces where conversations about millions of dollars floated above her like background noise. But something was different now, not in how others saw her, that had not changed, but in how she carried what she knew, the awareness that in one moment, one sentence, she had shifted the outcome of something far beyond her role. And that awareness did not make her louder, it made her quieter, more focused, more certain. Hours later, when her shift finally ended, the restaurant had thinned out, the energy replaced by the soft clinking of closing duties. Naomi stepped outside into the cool night air, the city stretching endlessly in front of her, and for the first time since the meeting, she pulled the card from her pocket, holding it between her fingers under the streetlight, the name printed clean and confident, Ethan Caldwell, a man whose decisions shaped industries, whose voice carried weight in rooms she had never been invited into. And now, somehow, there was a line connecting her to that world, thin but real. She looked at it for a long moment, not with excitement, not with fear, but with clarity, because she understood something that most people did not. Opportunity was not just about being seen, it was about what came after, what it required, what it changed, and whether it aligned with who you were before anyone noticed you. She slipped the card back into her pocket and began the walk toward the subway, her steps steady, measured, the city lights reflecting off the pavement like fragments of possibility. Somewhere across town, in a high-rise office that had not yet gone dark, Ethan Caldwell stood alone near a floor-to-ceiling window, the contract from earlier resting on his desk, untouched, its pages now marked with notes, corrections, questions, not because he doubted the deal entirely, but because he no longer accepted anything at face value, not anymore, not after tonight. He replayed the moment in his mind, not the accusation, not the risk, but the voice, calm, certain, unshaken. And what struck him most was not that she had been right, it was that she had spoken when she had nothing to gain and everything to lose, and that kind of clarity was rare, rarer than intelligence, rarer than experience. It was integrity, and integrity, in his world, was the most valuable asset of all. He glanced at the clock on the wall, then back at the empty chair across from his desk, and for the first time in a long time, he was not thinking about the next deal, the next acquisition, the next expansion. He was thinking about a conversation that had not happened yet, 9 o'clock, and whether the person who had changed everything tonight would choose to walk into a room where she would no longer be invisible, because the truth was, the offer he had made was not just an opportunity for her, it was a test for himself, to see if he could recognize value before it spoke, to see if he could build something different from the systems he had relied on for years. And as the city moved on outside, indifferent and relentless, two people in two different parts of it carried the same unspoken question into the night, not about what had happened, but about what would happen next. At exactly 8:57 in the morning, Naomi Brooks stood across the street from a building she had never entered before, her reflection faintly visible in the glass facade that stretched upward like a statement, not just of wealth, but of access. And for a moment she did not move, not because she was unsure, but because she understood the weight of thresholds, how crossing one could quietly redraw everything that came after. The card in her pocket felt heavier now, not as an object, but as a decision already made the night before. The city moved around her in its usual rhythm, people rushing, taxis sliding past, coffee cups in hand, but she stood still for one breath longer, then stepped forward. Inside, the air was different, cooler, controlled, the kind of environment designed to remove unpredictability. The lobby stretched wide with polished stone floors and soft lighting that reflected authority without saying a word. A receptionist glanced up briefly, then paused just long enough to notice something unusual. not Naomi's presence, but her composure. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, professional, neutral, and Naomi nodded once. "I have a meeting with Ethan Caldwell," she said, her voice steady, not rehearsed, just certain. The receptionist's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, not surprise, but recalibration, a quick glance at the schedule, a confirmation, then a gesture toward the elevators. 32nd floor, she said, and that was all. No questions, no doubt, just access. The elevator ride was silent, smooth, numbers lighting up one by one, and with each floor, Naomi felt the distance grow, not from the ground, but from the version of herself that had been expected to stay invisible. The doors opened to a quiet hallway lined with glass offices. Movement minimal, voices low, everything precise, intentional, and at the end of that hallway, a door stood slightly open, not wide, not closed, just enough to signal invitation without announcement. Ethan Caldwell was already inside, standing near his desk, reviewing something on a tablet, but he looked up the moment she stepped into the doorway, not delayed, not distracted, immediate. As if he had been expecting not just her arrival, but the exact moment it would happen. "You are early," he said, not as criticism, but observation, and Naomi stepped in fully, closing the door behind her with a soft click. "So are you," she replied, and the exchange was simple, but it set the tone, not hierarchical, not performative, just direct. Ethan allowed the faintest hint of a smile, not amusement, but acknowledgement, then gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "Sit," he said, and she did, without hesitation, without overthinking the space she now occupied. The desk between them was clear, no unnecessary clutter, just a folder, a pen, and the same contract from the night before, now marked, corrected, transformed from something dangerous into something understood. Ethan took his seat, leaning forward slightly, his attention focused, undivided. "Tell me what else we missed," he said, and the question was not a test, not a trap, it was an invitation, and Naomi did not rush to answer. She reached for the document, scanning it quickly, not for show, but for precision, and then she spoke, pointing out inconsistencies, subtle language shifts, cultural nuances that changed meaning in ways most people would overlook. And as she spoke, Ethan did not interrupt, did not redirect. He listened, fully, the way he should have listened the night before, the way he now understood was necessary. Minutes passed, then more. The conversation deepened, not just about the contract, but about interpretation, about communication, about the cost of assuming understanding without verification, and at some point, without announcement, without ceremony, the dynamic shifted again, not from employer to employee, not yet, but from observer to collaborator, and when Naomi finally finished, the room fell into a brief, thoughtful silence, not empty, but full of clarity. Ethan leaned back slightly, his gaze steady, measuring not just her knowledge, but her presence, her consistency, the way she carried certainty without needing validation. "You were not just listening last night," he said, "you were analyzing," and Naomi met his gaze, calm as ever. "Listening is analyzing," she replied, and that answer landed differently here, in this room, where being heard was expected, but truly listening was rare. Ethan nodded once, slower this time, because now the decision in front of him was no longer about potential, it was about placement, about where someone like her belonged in a system that had never been designed to notice her, and for the first time in a long time, he was not thinking about titles or roles, he was thinking about alignment, and how to build something that did not overlook the very thing that could change everything. The silence that followed was not empty, it was decisive, the kind of silence that marked the end of uncertainty and the beginning of direction, and Ethan Caldwell did not rush to fill it because he understood something now that he had not understood. The night before, that clarity did not come from speaking more, it came from listening long enough to recognize what mattered. He stood slowly from his chair, walking toward the window behind his desk where the city stretched wide and indifferent, the same city that had almost watched him sign away control under the illusion of understanding, and for a moment he looked out without saying anything, not because he was unsure, but because he was choosing his next move with the same precision he applied to every decision that carried weight. Naomi remained seated, not shifting, not filling the space, allowing the moment to settle without forcing it forward, because she understood something as well, that the outcome was no longer about proving anything, it was about alignment, and alignment could not be rushed. Ethan turned back toward her, his expression unchanged but his focus sharper, clearer. "I built my company on speed," he said, his voice calm, measured, decisions made quickly, opportunities taken before others even saw them. He paused briefly, not for effect, but for accuracy. But speed only works when you are seeing everything clearly, he added, and that sentence carried more than reflection, it carried adjustment, a shift in how he would operate moving forward. He stepped back toward the desk, resting one hand lightly against its edge, grounding the conversation not in theory, but in action. Yesterday, I was about to sign something I did not fully understand, he said, not defensively, not with embarrassment, just fact, and the only person in that room who saw it clearly was not sitting at the table. His gaze met hers directly, not as a challenge, not as evaluation, but as recognition. That is a failure in my system, not yours, and that distinction mattered, because it reframed everything, not as a lucky interruption, but as a structural gap that needed to be corrected. Naomi listened without interrupting, her posture steady, her expression unchanged, because she was not waiting for validation, she was observing intent. Ethan reached for the folder on his desk, sliding it slightly forward, not as an offer, but as a symbol. I do not need another voice that agrees with me, he said. I need someone who hears what is not being said, someone who notices what others miss before it becomes a problem. He paused again, not hesitating, but ensuring clarity. I need someone who will speak even when it is inconvenient, and the words were not directed at her position, they were directed at her pattern, the behavior she had already demonstrated without invitation. I am not offering you a title, he continued, his tone steady, grounded. I am offering you a seat where your voice changes outcomes, and that difference was deliberate, because titles could be assigned, but influence had to be earned. Naomi held his gaze for a moment longer, measuring the space between what was being said and what was being implied, because she understood that offers like this were not just opportunities, they were commitments, not just from him, but from her as well. And what happens when I disagree with you? She asked, her voice calm, not confrontational, but precise, and Ethan did not hesitate this time, not even for a second. Then you do your job, he replied, and the simplicity of that answer carried more weight than anything else he had said, because it removed condition, it removed expectation of compliance, it replaced it with responsibility, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because the decision was no longer his alone. Naomi leaned back slightly in her chair, not distancing herself, but creating space to think. Not about the building, not about the office, not about the man in front of her, but about the pattern of her own life, the moment she had been overlooked, the time she had spoken and been ignored, and the one moment that had changed everything because she chose to speak anyway. And when she leaned forward again, her decision was not dramatic, not emotional, it was aligned. Then I will need access, she said, not just to the room, but to the truth behind it, and Ethan nodded once. Immediately, because that was the only condition that mattered. You will have both, he said, and that was it. No contract signed, no formal agreement placed on the table, just an understanding built on one moment of truth. That had reshaped everything, and as the city continued moving outside, unaware and unchanged, inside that office something far more important had shifted, not power, not money, but perspective, because the person who had once been invisible was now impossible to ignore, and the man who once controlled the room had finally learned how to see it clearly.